My name's Bill Gorham, and I'm an active member of Stanford Alumni and Sustainability. We're thrilled to welcome you today to our Fireside chat with Professor Emerita Margot Gerritsen, who will discuss and answer questions from the audience about sustainable energy systems and energy equity. Before we dive into these exciting topics today, I'd like to start by sharing some background on our alumni group, Stanford Alumni and Sustainability. We're an interdisciplinary and intergenerational community of Stanford alumni engaged in careers around the environment and sustainability. Our vision is to create an impact network that is collectively working towards a sustainable future. We hold social and educational gatherings for members, both virtually and in person, and work to create an organized network to connect alumni and current students with advice, mentorship, and professional opportunities. We also have recently been building a consortium of university alumni for a sustainable planet in partnership with like-minded alumni groups from Harvard, MIT, Yale, and Dartmouth. We'll post links to learn more about our group in the chat for those who are interested. In a moment, Darren will introduce Professor Gerritsen, who will speak with us for about 20 minutes on sustainable energy systems with a theme of energy equity infused throughout. Then Darren and Akuti will facilitate Q&A for the remainder of our time together. We'll conclude promptly at 1 p.m. Pacific. Now, before we get started, here are a few housekeeping items. First, please note that we are recording this talk. Within the next couple of days, we'll send the recording link to all registrants via Stanford groups. You're welcome to use the chat to connect with fellow alumni and discuss the content throughout today's talk. If you find the chat distracting, you can click the caret button next to the chat box and unclick the Show Chat Previews button. Now, you can also enable closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. Now, to send a question for the Q&A portion of the talk, please use the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. This is different from the chat module, so please do not use the chat if you'd like your question to be seen by the moderators. With that, please welcome Bianca Patel to introduce our co-convening group, Explore Energy.
Thank you, Bill. Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca Patel, and I lead Explore Energy at Stanford. We are very excited to be co-convening this event today. To share a little bit about Explore Energy, we are the Energy Education and Student Engagement Program at the Precourt Institute for Energy, which is under the Dorr School. Our vision is to support all Stanford students who are interested in energy and propel them to make a purposeful impact in the world. We do this by serving as a hub in Stanford's energy ecosystem, and we also offer a suite of education and experiential learning opportunities. I'll post a link to our website in the chat if you're interested, and we'd love to engage with all of you further, even beyond this seminar. With that, it is my pleasure to pass it over to Akruti to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Bianca, and hi, everyone. My name is Akruti Gupta. I'm happy to be one of the moderators for today's discussion and be back with the Stanford community. I recently graduated from Stanford with my master's in the Atmosphere Energy program in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department, and now I'm working at the California Energy Commission on research and development topics related to demand flexibility, load management, and energy equity of our electricity system. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to an awesome discussion with Professor Gerritsen alongside my co-moderator, Darren, who I'll pass it on to introduce himself.
Thanks, Akruti. Hey, everyone. Just a bit of background on myself. I actually graduated far before this, but I was class of 2015. A little bit of my background, I've been in climate and energy sustainability basically my whole career. Started out doing solar cell research, eventually did power electronics for utility scale solar, worked at Tesla for a few years. More recently, I've been at Cruise, the self-driving company, focused on fleet charging and building some teams to make sure we can do that well. With that, it's my pleasure to move towards the highlight of our show, which is Professor Margot Gerritsen. So Margot is a Professor Emerita in the Department of Energy Resources Engineering at Stanford. From 2010 to 2018, she directed the ICME department, and since 2015, she's been the Senior Associate Dean for Educational Affairs in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. That's a mouthful, which means that it's important. And finally, she's also a co-director of Women in Data Science and the host of the WIDS podcast. Her research is pretty interesting. She focuses on computational mathematics, including search algorithm design, matrix computations, and her latest research include traffic congestion and emission simulations, as well as wildland, fire prediction, and mitigation. As impressive as that all is, Margot also has a dynamic personal background. She was born and raised in the Netherlands and spent 5 years teaching in New Zealand, but decided she appreciated the weather and terrain here in California. She's actively engaged in coastal ocean dynamics and yacht design, so definitely people should ask her about those. Now, with that, Margot, please feel free to introduce yourself and some of your work.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here. I recognize some of the names on the list of attendees, so really nice to reconnect with those people. So I've been at Stanford sort of on and off since 1991. I started in 1991 on my PhD at Stanford. That was in computer science, and I was working on an area called scientific computing, computational mathematics, which ultimately led me to energy. As Darren was saying, I'm now Emerita. So what does that mean? That means that I still have a position on campus. I still advise and co-advise students. I still connect with a lot of people. Occasionally I teach. But my main occupation is now outside of Stanford. And what I'm doing at the moment is I'm running a nonprofit. So I am not retired. My husband is retired. We moved here to Bend, Oregon a few years ago. What I do right now is I run the nonprofit Women in Data Science Worldwide. I started Women in Data Science, as Darren said, in 2015 on campus, and we spun it off. So that's the exciting news, that I'm now running a nonprofit. It's a startup nonprofit, and I'm learning a ton. Very different than doing research. So a little bit about what I've done in energy and why I liked it so much. You may wonder now. You heard a lot about sail design and oceans and traffic and so it seems that I'm all over the place. So what has driven me into these fields and why have I done things in so many different application areas? And the answer to that, first and foremost, is mathematics. I studied mathematics and applied mathematics and computational mathematics a little bit later on, which means that I use a lot of computers to do mathematics, simulation, data type of analysis, data-driven decision-making, because I thought math and computing and a little bit of physics would open many, many doors in application areas. When I was growing up, I wanted to be all kinds of things, from ornithologist to geoscientist to businesswoman to McKinsey partner, you name it. I wanted to be it all. And because I couldn't choose at the age of 18, I thought, let's just study math, because with math and computing, I can probably reinvent myself relatively quickly. And that's what I've really done in my career. So I started really building these foundations, and then got interested in fluid dynamics. Fluid dynamics led me to coastal oceans. Coastal oceans led me to sewage outfall problems and sustainability. Then, of course, climate change was really interesting. The oceans play a huge role in that. So studied that. Followed the money for a little bit when I was a faculty member in New Zealand after my PhD from Stanford. I went to New Zealand for 5 years. The money was in coastal ocean simulation and in sail design, because New Zealand is a huge country for sailing, and the America's Cup was in the country at the time. This is around 2000 and just before. So I got an opportunity to join their campaign. And doing sailing got me interested in the design of wind turbines, because there's also airflow. And as a Dutch person, I've always been a huge supporter of wind turbines. And so I dabbled into that a little bit, because my simulation codes and so on were capable of doing that. And then something really interesting happened in my life. In 2001, in New Zealand, with a young son and my first husband, we started thinking about moving back to the Bay Area. My first husband was a software engineer and an architect, and he wanted to move back to Silicon Valley, and we thought it would be really nice to go back to California. I had absolutely no intention to even applying at Stanford because I thought they would never accept me. And also, while I was a student, I thought Stanford was kind of a crazy place. And I thought, do I want to go back from relatively sleepy New Zealand to crazy, gang-ho, intense Stanford, particularly as a professor? My answer at that time was no. But then one day I got an email from the Department of Energy Science and Engineering. That's the new name. At that time, they were called Petroleum Engineering. And they said, hey, would you like to come back to Stanford, or at least interview for a position? You would have to reinvent yourself a bit. So here was this applied mathematician doing fluid flow, mostly ocean flows and some air flows. Would you like to reinvent yourself as a faculty member in petroleum engineering? And I knew very little about oil and gas. Honestly, at that time, all I probably knew was the difference between leaded and unleaded fuel at the pump. But I thought it would be interesting to explore this, not so much because I wanted to work in oil and gas directly, but because I was really interested in energy. So I applied, and to my astonishment, they accepted me, and so I moved to California. And my then husband, he got a job in Silicon Valley, and we were there from 2001 onwards to 2022. So in petroleum engineering, I ended up working on mitigating of harmful environmental impacts of oil recovery. And I focused primarily on heavy oil recovery. And that has led me to a lot of big debates and discussions with people who say, why are you working with the oil industry? That's absolutely uncalled for. You shouldn't be doing that. But my view at the time was that if you can mitigate the impacts, then you can help out. So that was my thought. And I did that for about 10 years. In the meantime, also got really interested in other sources of energy. So wind turbine placement optimization was something I started working on with people in New Zealand and continued to work on while I was at Stanford. And then, around 2008 and 2009, I just received tenure, and the Woods Institute for the Environment on campus that you may be familiar with asked me if I wanted to become a little bit more active in Woods and maybe run some workshops or other activities, pulling in experts from all over, creating places for dialogue between various stakeholders in energy, because it's always a problem when you're wanting to build energy systems to get on the same line as other people. The ISOs come in, the industry comes in, local environmental groups come in, the researchers come in. The consumers come in, economists come in, lawyers come in. It's always a really messy place. And Woods wanted to be an independent, impartial place where people could get together, all these stakeholders could get together and sort out their differences. So I said, well, that sounds fun. I wanted to take a break a little bit from research and do something non-petroleum. And I jumped on large-scale solar, which was a really, really hot topic at the time. George Bush in the second administration had started some incentives, particularly around loan guarantee programs for large-scale solar. The first Obama administration continued that. And it was sort of a make or break year in 2009 and then later 2010 for large-scale solar. And there were a lot of frictions between the stakeholders. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be a challenge to bring all these people together on campus and see if we can bring them closer? So we did in a large-scale solar forum. That got me really excited about connecting to government, connecting to policymakers. So spent a lot of time in DC, spent some time in Sacramento talking to people at NGOs, like the NRDC and the Environmental Defense Fund and things like that. as well as policymakers. And at that time, I also started a podcast on energy issues because, it sort of opened up many doors for me. So in the meantime, I was still working a little bit on oil and gas, of course, and started picking up work in large-scale solar, but mostly community engagement and this sort of conflict resolution, if you like. I started teaching a lot of courses on campus on broader impacts of energy. So one course around unintended consequences of policy decisions of energy. Got really interested in that. Had some students who were working on local solutions for energy systems. One student was really interested in energy for small island communities in Alaska. At that time, also 2008 and 9 and 10, if you remember, we had the financial crisis. The oil price went up like crazy, and the diesel price went up like crazy. And there were a lot of small communities in Hawaii, in Alaska, in the Pacific, also in Europe, and particularly island communities that were reliant on diesel fuel, had invested in big storage tanks for diesel, and ended up spending, because of tripling of the diesel price, most of their income on that fuel. And it was a terrible situation for them to be in. And this student got interested in trying to find solutions to break that horrible what do you call that sorry, can't think of the word, that you're dependent, the dependency that these communities had on this very expensive diesel. So that was interesting. And then I started traveling around a bit, visiting island communities and talking about solutions there. And so all kinds of other things got sort of thrown at me at that time. And I started working a little bit with Mark Jacobson on campus, who you may know from the Solution Project, and looking at the work that he was doing and co-advising some students. And then, gradually I got more students who were interested in large-scale political energy programs. How would you move a country away from oil and gas to renewable? How do you do that without having negative impacts on the environment or the economies elsewhere? I got involved a bit in Europe with some policy making. At that time, Europe made a tremendously bad decision and to go big time into biofuels, which sounded great but had really negative impacts on palm or on the environment in tropical countries, because Europe started relying on palm oil. There was just so much going on, as you can tell from this story. In energy, the last couple of years that I was really active, so now I mostly do this nonprofit, but the last years we did something that my colleagues didn't like all that much in my old Department of Petroleum Engineering, and that was actually looking at possibilities to decommission internal combustion engine vehicles. You can imagine that my former collaborators from oil companies also thought I had gone over to the dark side. But it seemed pretty bright to me. It was super fun to work in that area for a bit. Anyway, there's a little bit of a brain dump. And what is the morale of the story? I like a lot of things about energy. I'm super interested in both the technology, but also the socioeconomic implications, political decisions. I'm really interested in the question about how do you get communities to accept and adopt renewable energy. I learned a lot along the way, really interesting case studies that I'm happy to tell you about, fun stories, sad stories around community engagement that sometimes, often actually can make or break an energy project. And it all started with my knowledge of mathematics, because in policy decisions you don't always get to use mathematics, but in optimization and placement, optimization of placement of renewable energy projects or oil and gas projects, for sure you need a lot of mathematics. So it's been a fantastic journey And I've dabbled in many different things, and I'm very fortunate about that. And let me stop here and just see what sort of questions come up for people, and what you would like to hear about.
Yeah, thanks, Margot. What an incredible background. And when you said you started with mathematics, it reminds me of that XKCD comic. I don't know if people here have said it.
Yeah, I know.
Seen it, but
I'm
they're
a big
like,
fan. Yeah.
you've got the biologist over here. It's like chemist says, oh, this is more fundamental than biology. And the physicist says, oh, well, it's all physics at the end of the day. And then all the way over there is the mathematician. So I think you were hitting on something there.
It honestly, life is really just math. Yeah. I think
That's the lesson of this panel, folks. But why don't we start off with the last thing that you mentioned, which is working to on the Clean Cars for All program, which I think you were alluding to, and basically decommissioning some of these ICE vehicles, especially to help low-income and disadvantaged communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've learned in that process, and what are the things that people should consider on a high level?
Yeah, really interesting. You know, why did I get into this stuff? Let me tell you a little bit about that. It all started with me moving to Santa Cruz for a couple of years and commuting multiple times per day on Highway 17, which you may remember, between Santa Cruz and Los Gatos. Trying to understand traffic flow problems on Highway 17, mountainous road, really difficult to understand traffic flow there, and potential impacts of increased traffic. We were fighting in the place where I was living, which was Scotts Valley, close to Santa Cruz, with the Googles and other big companies that wanted to buy up a lot of apartment complexes to put commuting software engineers and saying to the community, don't worry about it. You know, we'll give you lots of tax revenue, and we will transport them in buses over 17. So I got into that because I wasn't at all convinced that buses on a mountainous road would be helpful. So I started building transportation models, because that's what you do when you're a mathematician. You have questions like this. You say, let's see if I can build a model. And they got really interested in other communities around the Bay, started getting interested in that traffic flow modeling, including Sonoma County. And this is where my journey in Clean Cars for All and EV adoption really started. Sonoma County had a real problem with pollution, that and local pollution of 101 and roads like 12 that cut across Sonoma County. And the congestion on their roads was increasing. They wanted some advice on how to reduce this congestion, and they wanted advice on how to reduce pollution, particularly local pollution, because they said not only is that impacting all of us, you know, in terms of congestion, that just adds a lot of costs, right, to everyone's life, but it's particularly hurting low-income people who live close to these traffic corridors, and the pollution levels were very much higher there. And I had a few students working with me on this traffic flow modeling at the time. We said, let's go into Sonoma County and see if we can advise them on their particular situation. And one of the things that Sonoma was hoping to do is get a lot of their low-income folks moving over to EVs or other kinds of transport. And other people at Stanford and other universities had suggested electric bike programs and getting their people signed up for Clean Cars for All, which was a program that was running in California. And it just wasn't working. And we got really interested in, why is this not working in Sonoma, and then realized that Clean Cars for All really wasn't designed, you know, in our opinion, the best way for California. It wanted to get cars into the hands of low-income people But first of all, they looked at low income, not at low wealth. And so if you looked at who was actually using the program, there were a lot of people that were relatively high wealth, but low income. So retirees, for example, that on paper didn't get very high incomes, but they had a lot of savings. And so they were not quite the people that wanted to be targeted. And then the people in Sonoma County, a lot of them working in the wineries and agriculture, in the service industry for tourism, they just couldn't get into those programs because of their inability to get loans, which you had to be able to close for electric vehicles because of their credit rating, and that just wasn't helping. And so ultimately, and the other thing that happened in Clean Cars for All, we went through that whole application area, the application process for Clean Cars for All, and we saw that a lot of these people in Sonoma that we talked to and that we tried to guide through this program just couldn't make it through all of those hurdles. There were a lot of places where they had to put in information that they didn't have, that they didn't want to put in because maybe they were not registered. They were really afraid that ICE would come in and kick them out. There were just so many examples of barriers along the way. So that became a project in its own right. How would you redesign something like Clean Cars for All? And that got us then talking to a lot of places nationally. A lot of other incentives that were created nationally about how do you actually get EV adoption in a way that brings EVs to people that could potentially benefit from them, and reduce some of that local pollution also. The other thing is, when you start thinking about EV adoption, it all sounds so fantastic, but of course you have to then think about charging stations, and a lot of those people that were targeted by Clean Cars for All live in apartment dwellings, and there were no charging stations available. There's so many aspects to this. There were people that we talked to in that community that said, well, even if you give me to me for free, I'd rather have an ICE vehicle, in internal combustion engine vehicle, because it's reliable and I know how to tinker on those cars. And we have a cousin who can help us with that if something breaks down, but we have no idea how to work with an EV. So there were just so many learnings there. And for me and my students, our eyes really opened. Electric bikes, sound great. Buses sound great, but for those people, it doesn't always work. We talked to people who were dependent on buses, and because they only had the buses, it limited the places they could work a lot. You can only work then if you have access to a bus stop. A lot of the people we talked to worked in the service industry. They're working really late at night. There were all kinds of security concerns related to that. Those people are not going to hop on an electric bike at 1 a.m. in the morning to go back to their home. Often they're women, and they don't want to be out after midnight alone on the bike. And so a lot of these programs that we think of, electric scooters and so on, they just don't often take into account what life is really like for people in those areas. So anyway, long story, but really interesting.
That's fascinating. And each of those, I feel like you could dive and talk 15 minutes on, the policy implications of those. I'm curious, you mentioned a lot of the problems around it. And given that I work in the area of charging, I just wanted to focus on that. You mentioned the issue of getting charging infrastructure in these multi-unit dwellings, apartment buildings. It certainly is a challenge. Have there been any interesting ideas that have been proposed to get over a barrier like that?
Yeah, at the time, and this is now a few years ago, we did this work before COVID, and the first years of COVID, there were a lot of talks with companies like Walmart, and the dollar store and others, that you can find in many of those places, to see if they could put on a lot more of those charging stations, but also overnight charging as possibility. So that was one thing. Of course, there are certainly apartment complexes and housing agencies that started putting chargers in these apartment complexes. Then you have the problem with maintenance. So we went to some of these apartment complexes that had these chargers. These were not the fast chargers that you could find for Tesla. So these were really slow drip chargers, as they said. And so the car would have to be there for a long period overnight. And for a lot of us, that seems okay. We go to work 9 to 5, we come home and we can charge the car overnight. That's not a problem. But for a lot of those people, they had night shifts. They were sharing cars with others. They couldn't afford to have a car just for themselves. And so an electric car was tough because it really couldn't be used 24 hours a day for all these different shifts that people had that were sharing the cars. And so then you need fast charging, and you get into a different class of car, and that was not affordable for those people.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are all kinds of really interesting things. The maintenance of these and the speed of charging, that's that just remains a big problem also for other people, right? So if you can't have a fast home charger on 240 circuit, for example, it's really tough.
Yeah, and sometimes when we think about folks who are in the low income spectrum, it's not only income, it's also they're time poor too. So you can't necessarily wait all that
Yes.
long.
That's it. And that brings me to other things that we sometimes overlook, which I learned with traffic models. Very often you say, if you have congestion, put in a carpool lane. But carpool lanes don't always work, particularly not in those areas, because the people that can use them are the ones that have schedules that align with people they share the cars with, and that's not that doesn't happen very often. Or the people that have hybrid cars and electric cars, and we just said they can't afford them. So often what happens in those communities, when you put in a carpool lane, it's the richer people that take advantage, the ones that have the hybrids or the electric cars. And these poorer people that are really running most miles commuting and have the older cars that are polluting more, they're now stuck even more on the lanes that are not the carpool lanes. And they're in traffic more. Their time is incredibly critical for them, right? So they cannot afford to be late. They cannot, and so this is another problem with buses. Buses late, they get 10 minutes late for a shift. They won't get paid that day. It's really difficult for them. The same with these fast track lanes that people have put in. They often are trumpeted as being, equitable systems. If you can pay, you can go on those lanes. If you can't pay, that's okay. You still have access to the motorway. But of course, slow traffic for someone on a low income is they can't afford the fast track lanes, and then this often slower lanes that are not fast track. It just hurts them so much. We've had people say, because of a fast track lane put in on 680, their commute times has now increased by 20 minutes. It means they had to drop one of their 3 jobs. And dropping one of their 3 jobs means that their second child cannot go to college. It's as simple as that. And we often don't think about those kind of unintended consequences of these systems. And what I find so exciting about this from a research point of view, or with my professor hat on, is thinking through these potential consequences of designs is incredibly challenging and interesting, and we don't teach students often enough about this. This was one of the reasons why I started this class on unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I do want to move on to another topic, but before we do that, I'll just mention some ideas, and maybe you will tell me after the panel these are bad ideas. But I think it might be interesting to figure out, like, if charging is a concern, right? Is there some way to subsidize fast charging credits for folks, or actually work with workplaces to install level 2 charging at the places where they're going to be parking their car anyway? You can tell me why they're bad ideas later. Let's move on to the next topic, which is what you alluded to before, this your work in the oil and gas industry and how much controversy that courted. And I know this is a big topic at Stanford as well. Can you explain your take on researchers receiving funding from oil and gas companies? And why do you think there's such a vocal part of the environmental community that opposes this?
Yeah, I completely understand. We want to move away from oil and gas. Like I said, my own thought was at the time when I was working on this, I'm going to go into this field and I'm going to look at places where I can make the processes that are using better. And so we worked on processes that reduced the pollution caused by exploration and production. And you can make a difference there. Of course, then you accept, at that time I accepted that we were using oil and gas, and you look at how long it takes to move a system. You can say, I'm not going to invest anything in the system that I want to ultimately get rid of. Or you can say, I know that even if we had a Marshall Plan for renewable energy, it would take us 10 years or 15 years to build this infrastructure. These are huge infrastructure projects. So even with a Marshall Plan, if we had that, it would take a certain amount of time. In that time, we're still using oil and gas. And if in that time you can reduce the emissions associated with oil and gas, you are helping. And so that's what I chose to work on.
Yeah,
Does that make me? Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So now there are, of course, people that work in oil and gas because they say, hey, this is our main energy source and it's super interesting, and I like the field. I like the people that are working with us. I've invested so many years of my research life into doing reservoir modeling and things like that. I also do other things. So a lot of people working in oil and gas do carbon sequestration. So a lot of the work done in carbon sequestration wouldn't have been possible without those people who know about oil and gas. And we're using in carbon sequestration work, in geothermal work, we're using a lot of the research that was done for oil and gas. And so the boundaries sometimes between energy sources, particularly when you look at subsurface sources, or processes such as carbon sequestration and oil and gas, they're very, very, very blurry. And so carbon sequestration work would not have been possible without the work in reservoirs. Now you can go back and you can say, hey, but if we didn't have oil and gas, we wouldn't need carbon sequestration either. But we are the economies we are thanks to oil and gas, right? So when you think about it, what the oil and gas has done for us in the last 100 years or so, it's really quite amazing because of the high energy density. We have been able to build what we have.
Yeah.
So it is a difficult situation, and with a lot of the students, of course, they're super concerned. I am too, and I can completely understand that they say it's everything or nothing. But there is a little bit of you're either bad or you're good. There's a bit of black and white thinking in this, and in reality, when you look at what's happening in this world, it's a little bit blurry. A little bit gray. Same, for example, when you look at who has invested most in wind turbine development, in solar systems, a lot of that money comes from the energy world and energy investors, and they become rich and they can make those investments because of oil and gas. So again, there it's a little bit. No, it's hard to draw lines. It's hard to say. The same with divestment. You can say, we're going to divest from oil and gas, but are you also then going to divest from plastics? Are you going to divest from companies that sell fleece wear? There's so many oil byproducts and oil products that we're using that are integrated in our lives. It starts to get a little bit tough. I remember at some point having a discussion with people. I don't know if you remember this, but maybe you were on campus at the time. There was a demonstration, occupation of the quad, the main quad for some time with people, right, for divestment. And so I went up to them. They were right in front of Building 10. I started talking to them, and a lot of them were my students, so I supported their action. But they were there protesting oil and gas, and they were wearing fleeces. They were getting ready in their tents that were made from materials that came from oil and gas, and they had no idea. When it was at Thanksgiving break, and I was asking them, so how long are you going to camp out for? They said, oh, we're camping here for a while. We're going to camp again after Thanksgiving. I said, where are you going to go on Thanksgiving break? We're flying home. So, they're, of course, also, we are as humans, particularly in the Western world, so dependent on and oil and gas has been integrated so much in our lives that we're using so much of it. It's really, really difficult to break from that completely.
Yeah.
Do we need to move? Yeah, and that's why ultimately I broke off with oil and gas, and so have many of my colleagues.
Yeah, it reminds me, this kind of binary switch, kind of reminds me of the debate between hybrids and EVs. And there are a lot of people who want to go wholesale completely into EVs, but for national security concerns, for the fact that a lot of refining happens in China in a very not clean way, the path there may actually lie in hybrids, which are more affordable too, and can make a more immediate impact. But ultimately, we kind of know where the end game is. I wanted to ask one last question before handing it off to Akruti. You mentioned kind of these large scale systems, and what you're describing in terms of maybe some environmental opposition is not limited to oil and gas, but sometimes also to large scale solar projects or wind projects or nuclear. I know people, have senses on that too. Can you describe a bit more about your take on that?
Yeah, it's really again, the word of this lunch is complexity. Complexity in technologies, and also complexity in human behavior and human responses. What I really found incredibly interesting, and I learned so much from that, is when I was active in large scale solar. So here, you want to move away from oil and gas, and the sun is the most powerful resource that we have, right? I mean, if you look at how much solar energy we have at any moment, it's around 4,000, 5,000 times what we consume. Okay, so if you look at energy availability, it's the sun is it, so I was all for large scale solar. And then you start working with all these stakeholders to get large scale solar projects off the ground. And you notice that, and you see firsthand that a lot of these large scale solar projects are not happening because of local opposition, often from environmental groups. And that makes you think, well, why? We all want to move away from oil and gas. We're putting these large scale solar projects in, and here are environmental groups that are opposed. And of course, then when you start thinking, is it's completely logical. You always have this not in my backyard situation, but you also have environmental groups in areas like the Mojave Desert, Southern California, places of Arizona, who for decades have fought to keep the environment around them pristine, right? And to protect maybe a certain animal. And I will give you the example of the desert tortoise. So with large-scale solar projects in 2009 and 2010, the desert tortoise was a little bit of the bane of the large-scale solar industry. All of the national chapters of the large environmental organization wanted solar. They want to move away from oil and gas. They want wind, they want solar, they want geothermal. The local chapters of these organizations were absolutely against building these large-scale solar plants because they felt it would threaten the desert tortoise, and they had been working for decades on protecting those. So here you come in and you say to these people whose passion it was to protect those animals, hey, give that up for the greater good, and look at this with a different perspective. Now, in the end, by the way, it turned out that the desert tortoise was much, much more abundant than people thought before. So that was to some extent the good news. I was baffled by this also because there are lots of projects going on in the desert. So there are golf courses that are being built, right? And they're very large and they take a lot of water. And so they're really environmentally not very friendly. There was off-road recreational vehicle areas, massive numbers of acres, thousands and thousands of acres where people could go in and drive their recreational vehicles around. A lot of the people in these environmental groups were doing that also. Well, a tortoise doesn't like being overrun by an ATV either. And so there are all these conflicting things you see locally. Say, why do you allow this but not that? Why do you make this such a big deal and not that? And to me, it just drove home that when you're developing these projects, you can make national decisions. You can say, we're going to drive towards solar, we're going to drive towards wind, but you need an enormous amount of work to get the local communities to buy in. This is particularly difficult in a place like the United States, where there is not a one-stop shop for approval. So that's another thing that you have to think about. If you want to build a wind farm, if you want to build a large-scale solar project, you need to get the local county supporting it. You need to get the local district supporting it. You need to get the state supporting it. You need to get the FERC supporting it. And there's no place you can go to say, I want to build this, you sort this out. You get all the permits. You have to go through these processes one after another. And it's incredibly long and difficult process. There are countries where building large-scale infrastructure for renewable energy is much faster, much simpler. And these tend to be countries, for example, like China, where there is not as much power at the local level, right? And so, but in the States, this is very, very difficult. And so I've seen a lot of projects where at first you think, oh, this is exactly what we have to do, like offshore wind. In my mind, a total no-brainer. We have so much of it in the United States. How come that only 2 years ago we built our first wind farm? Well, that's because of Cape Wind that became the bane of the offshore industry. Why did it take so long for onshore wind to really get started in the United States? We're reasonably okay now. We have quite a bit, particularly in a state like Texas. Texas is doing very well. By the way, a lot of people find that very surprising because they think Texas is oil and gas, but they're very progressive when it comes to wind energy. And there are lots of other reasons for that too, economic reasons and so on, that we can go into. But why did it take so long? Because the first wind farm in California was built in the breeding ground of eagles. And birds became the bane of the wind industry. There's so many examples like that. So it's been fascinating, and it just made me realize, how much work goes into this transition, and also that explains to some extent why it's taking so long. It's not the technology that is holding this back. We have the technology, we've had it for a long time. It's not the resource. I mean, we have plenty of resource in the United States, particularly. We have wind, we have solar, there's plenty of it. But it is the actual implementation in these locations and the permitting process and the financial structure that's put around it that keeps these projects from being built faster than we would like.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm pretty sure you're aligned that we should want to protect the desert tortoise and we should want to protect the hawks, and we don't want to be necessarily the same as China. But these are some really considerations to raise.
The thing is, this is the thing, and that's often really, really hard also for people to accept, is there is not a single energy source that is squeaky clean. And if we want to move away from oil and gas, then we cannot ask for the alternative to be squeaky clean, because it does not exist, right? So wind has problems with bats, with birds, and I always think, well, let's put this in perspective. Birds, yes, they are killed. Electricity lines, our large, our cars, our buildings, our pollution is killing way more birds than wind turbines. So if we say we're not going to build a wind farm, there is a choice there and a consequence. The consequence is that you're going to use gas and oil more than you have. That brings pollution that is also responsible for killing a lot of birds. So there's always this trade-off. So you can say we're not going to do it until no birds are killed, or you can say if we don't do it, more birds are getting killed because of these other consequences. And so you always have to, it's really difficult, but you have to think about it in these larger perspectives. And it's tough. It's tough for someone who really wants to do best for the environment to acknowledge, yeah, if I put in a large-scale solar plant, it's going to also have environmental impacts. And to me, the question is always, what is the better solution, not is what is the squeaky clean solution, because we won't get anywhere if that's what we do. So we always have to look at it. We say, can we mitigate any harmful environmental impacts? And are we making the decisions that make our environment better off? And there is no such thing as 100% completely clean and harmless infrastructure, energy infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing you mentioned, or a few of the projects you've mentioned have been, sort of large scale solar, looking at big projects like wind, and increasingly we're moving towards a more decentralized energy system. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the projects and work around the microgrids that you mentioned earlier, and how some of the lessons that you've learned in these large scale projects related to unintended consequences or community engagement may be able to be applied to sort of a different set of technologies or a different kind of energy system moving forward.
Yes, one thing that is certainly true, that in the West, in the United States and Europe, we have relied for a long time on central delivery of energy. So that's how people think. Big transmission lines, central plants that, with transmission lines going various places. And for all kinds of reasons, also related to wildland fires, by the way, because if you have large transmission lines and you have these central things, fire danger increases. So people are in California also rethinking our central grids, say we need distributed model with smaller grids so that we can avoid having these transmission line going through fire prone areas. So really interesting developments. When you start looking at the developing world, it makes no sense to build these central systems there. So I am incredibly happy that we're looking at distributed systems. You need to get the right incentives in place for people to do that. And there are some countries that have done that a little bit better than others. For these isolated communities, there's often just no choice, right? So they have to import. They either have to import things like diesel, something that can reach them. So why diesel? Because you can ship it. You can maybe truck it in if necessary. You can put it in big vats and put it on a boat. You can truck it when there's ice, say in these isolated Alaskan regions. And other things are really not possible. Gas is much harder, so anyway, it's a diesel. Coal is much harder. Or you can use your own natural resources. So distributed and for those communities, that is all about local financing. So that is about how does a community afford such a system? What assistance do they get? Have they invested already in something that they've mortgaged? And so here's an example of a small town in Alaska that we looked at. They had in 2005 bought into $1 million diesel tank. This is a community with 1,000 people. $1 million for that community in a very low income community. That was an incredible investment. And of course, those investments are mortgaged, right? So they cannot pay for these things cash. They mortgage it. So they pay off this mortgages in about 30 years. When the diesel price went up, we said, you should build a wind turbine. You've got fantastic wind. We did the calculation. My student did the calculations. It all works out really well. But hey, the wind turbine was $1 million. They cannot, as a village, say, okay, well, let's just forget about the diesel tank. We'll pay off that loan. But in the meantime, we'll get another loan out for $1 million for this wind turbine. They just cannot afford it unless they can get some pretty good deals. Now, here's the problem, that the mortgage rates are, unless you have some sort of loan guarantee program, when you go to a lender, they look at a risk reward curve, and for these small communities, it leads to interest rates that are really not super attractive. This is the big problem, right? That there's so much inequity in our financial system that for projects that are relatively new, like renewable energy projects, your financial costs, your capital cost, the investment costs are very, very much higher than for traditional energy systems that are much better known. The risks are better known. And so banks that tend to be risk averse tend to give better mortgage rates for those. So it's a financial question. It's how can you get a community like that to afford such an investment? Obviously, you need to subsidize, you need to help them out. At that time, with the enormous spike in diesel, and Alaska, who gets a lot of revenue from oil and gas, as you probably know, it was relatively simple because the Alaska state government just said, we're going to subsidize the heck out of it. So they bought up some of these old mortgages to say, we'll forgive you for them, we'll pay them off, here's some more, we'll lend you another $1 million at a relatively low interest rate. Other communities just can't afford that. So, it requires really a lot of foresight. It requires financial institutions to take maybe some more risks. And that becomes easier as you build more of those systems. The more wind farms we build, the lower the mortgage rates are going to be for these wind farms, because it's no longer seen as such a tremendous risk. If a wind farm defaults, the bank gets the wind farm. Now maybe the bank says, okay, we can actually make that wind farm work. When you don't have that many wind farms, the bank will say, well, okay, that's my collateral, but if you default on your loan, what am I going to do with this? That's just too big of a risk for me. So loan guarantee programs can really help out with that. And now in terms of, so a comment on rooftop solar, it's a fantastic thing, of course, for people to do. We oftentimes, by the way, large community-based solar projects are much better for us. So we can all say, put it on your rooftop. But if we can pool our money together as a community and build a regional or town wide, for each town, for example, in Bend, we've done this here in Oregon, build a community solar project, then we reap the benefits of economies of scale. We can design these better. Not all roofs are optimal, right? In this. So in Bend, I'm investing in the community solar project and not put solar on my house, because it is much better for me to put my $14,000 or whatever it would cost to put money on solar on my roof, to put it in the community project, because the bang for the buck is much higher, and then just extract my energy from there. So what I'm really hoping is that we're starting to go to community supported solar, and there are a lot of nonprofits that are working in that area.
So this is a great segue to tackle some of our audience questions. There's no way we're going to be able to get to all of them, but since we're on the topic of solar, I think there have been a few questions out there around whether utilities can be a helpful factor in terms of coming up with creative financing mechanisms, or whether they are maybe counterproductive in trying to reduce the adoption of rooftop solar. Can you shed a little bit more light on what you see?
I've seen all variations of that. I've seen places where utility companies really jumped on it and were very helpful, particularly when there are win-wins. And so think, for example, about a company like PG&E. They're paying huge penalties because of wildland fires that were caused by their downed lines or their lack of maintenance. Or anyway, they were found culpable for some of these really terrible wildland fires. A company like that is really starting to see distributed electricity is really good for us, because if we help, as I said before, then we don't need to put in dangerous or risky transmission lines to these isolated communities, say in what we call the wildland urban interface. So in California, there are several million people who live in this wildland urban interface. They're living away from the towns into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, for example, into the foothills of the Trinity Mountains, in the hills in Napa and Sonoma, sort of those areas, and south as well. And those are the areas that are most fire that have the highest fire risk. And so they want to avoid being found culpable again, and paying out billions of dollars in damages. So there are incentives there then to build distributed solar. You've also seen with companies that are heavily embedded in urban infrastructure some resistance. Why? Because all of these rooftop solar projects require a redesign of the grid, the local grid. That is an investment from their side. They need to deal with intermittent, coming and going of these local inputs. That they saw that, and I don't think it is as expensive as they feared, but they saw that in the beginning as a huge potential cost for them. Is how do you make sure can a local grid work and operate well with a certain what percentage of roof generated solar, individual solar. But now what you're seeing also is that in communities, people start, Stanford did the same. Stanford doesn't have many rooftop solar projects. When you look around campus, is one thing that you noticed is that there's not that much. There's some of the new buildings that have it on there. Y2E2 has it on there, but it's kind of small. But what is Stanford doing? It's buying up land and building community solar projects where the sun is better, where they can optimize placement of solar panels, and then they ship it back to campus, right? So you see that happening more and more as well.
Great. And I know we're actually a little over time. I'm not sure if we have several questions. I'm going to quickly put one more in related to vehicle to grid charging and bidirectional EV charging, and how that might, the question here is for you to share your opinion on the impact of universal evening V2G EV charging, and how that would impact the shedding of fossil fuels and nuclear power on our electricity grid. And then maybe I'll add in a little bit of an element there of how we can think about the availability of that type of technology to communities across California or the United States, from your perspective.
Sorry, I lost you in the beginning of the question a little bit because my internet is a bit intermittent. So are you wondering if that's a solution or what the status is of that now?
I think your opinion on the status of V2G bidirectional charging and how it might impact the grid at the moment, and what we might need to be doing looking forward as we try to integrate it into our grid. I know that's a loaded question for right at the end, but
yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and it's one, unfortunately, I am not knowledgeable enough to really know that the grids that we have and the direct current versus AC/DC, which we have on a lot of our power lines, that's such a complicated thing. So much comes into play, losses over miles, the way that you're designing your grids, localized DC kind of grids are really interesting for many reasons. Some people are really, really interested also in long long distance lines with DC, but unfortunately I am not well enough informed on what the latest is there to say anything sensible. So I will have to skip that question, I'm afraid.
Not at all a problem. We've learned so much already from everything else you've been able to enlighten us on. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the audience for joining as well. We'll be sharing the recording early next week, so hopefully that gets out there for everyone to take a look at again in case you need to review some of this incredible information we've gotten in the last hour. So thank you again so much, Margot, for your time.
Thanks all. It was a pleasure to be here.
And thank you everyone who has attended. Margot was generous enough to share her LinkedIn, and she actually has encouraged folks who did not get their questions answered to please reach out. And I don't think a lot of speakers do that. So thank you again.
Yeah. Anyone who connects with me on LinkedIn because of this session, I will say yes to the connection request.
Perfect. All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody.